Good evening, everyone. My name is Allie Stewart from Beach Cities Health District. I want to thank you all for joining us here tonight. And I'm going to turn it over right away to Anthony Toronto from Redondo Beach Unified School District.
Hi, Allie. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. As Allie said, my name is Anthony Toronto. I'm the Executive Director of Student Services for the Redondo Beach Unified School District. We are thrilled to have you here from Redondo Beach, Hermosa Beach, and Manhattan Beach, as well as any surrounding cities. We are glad to have you here tonight. So tonight's event is part of the Families Connected Speaker Series, which is presented by the Beach Cities Health District and South Bay Families Connected in partnership with the Redondo Beach Unified School District, Manhattan Beach Unified School District, and the Hermosa Beach City School District. Tonight, I'm honored to introduce Dr. David Schonfeld from Children's Hospital of Los Angeles, specifically the Center for National Center for Crisis and Bereavement. Dr. Schonfeld is probably the leading expert across the country when it comes to assisting schools and communities in the aftermath of a crisis, in this case, a pandemic. Tonight, he is here to share how we can support the mental health and well-being of our students as we move closer to thriving rather than surviving. So without further ado, I'm going to turn everything over to Dr. Schonfeld. Dr. Schonfeld, welcome, and thank you so much for being here this evening. It's great to see you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. So what I wanted to do was to spend the time talking a little bit about some practical advice about how do we support our children during the current COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm going to start out, this is going to be focused on parents and other caregivers, and just for the interest of time, I hope people don't mind, I'll just refer to them as parents, although I recognize that some caregivers are grandparents and some uncles or other individuals, but just hard to say all of that every time. So this will be geared towards parents, other caregivers, and other adults who support children, such as educators. And we find that they often tend to underestimate actually the extent of children's reactions to a crisis situation, especially related to how they feel. If we do a good job, we can sometimes observe how children behave, but we can't observe how they feel. We actually have to ask them about that. And to underscore that, this was one of the posters that was used by Project Liberty in New York City about 6 months after the World Trade Center attacks on September 11th. And the taglines on each of the posters were the same, if only the signs were this easy to read, but they aren't that easy to read for a number of reasons. One is that children may actually withhold complaints of their reactions because of concerns that those reactions are abnormal or at least inappropriate, or sometimes they just want to protect the parents or other adults who are visibly upset. And adults, including parents and educators, tend to avoid discussion of troubling events in order not to contribute to children's distress, afraid somehow that they're just going to upset them or say and or do the wrong thing and just make matters worse. I hear a lot of people say, if I don't know what to say, it's best to say nothing. But I would say saying nothing is precisely the wrong thing to say in a crisis situation, because it communicates to children that adults are either unaware, unconcerned, unable, or just unwilling to be of assistance. And those are all poor messages for kids or adults to hear. So let me start by talking about some of the common reactions to a crisis that can be seen among children. And I'm going to say that I'm going to be talking about kids, but actually almost everything I say applies to adults as well, often equally so. But these are some of the common reactions, although the most common reaction is actually not on this slide, and that's nothing. As I already mentioned, a lot of times you won't see anything, but the issues may still be there. So probably the most obvious one are going to be fears related to the pandemic, becoming afraid of becoming infected, ill, or dying. But you can also include in this anxiety. And that will include fears that aren't specifically related to the crisis. For example, children may become more fearful of the dark, even though light doesn't stop the spread of COVID-19. It's just they become more fearful in general. And so developmental fears, such as around the dark, can also increase. We also often see school avoidance after almost any crisis event. I see it obviously after school shootings, but I also see this after natural disasters, such as floods or wildfires when they occur outside of school hours, say on the weekend. Kids are still hesitant when schools reopen to come back to school. Some of that may be that they're reluctant to separate from their parents or other caregivers, for fear that something will happen if those people are not there to protect them in some way. But they may also be afraid to leave those that they care about because they want to be present to try and protect them in some way as well. Now, after sheltering at home for extended periods of time as kids return to school, we should expect that they're going to be afraid to return to public spaces such as schools, particularly while the virus is still circulating, and particularly if they are not able to be vaccinated yet. And many parents, of course, are also reluctant to send their children, and kids pick up on that as well. Another common reaction will be sleep problems. That can be trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, difficulty waking in the morning, nightmares, or other disruptions in sleep. And when kids don't sleep well, parents don't sleep well. And when parents don't sleep well, pediatricians such as myself don't sleep well. So we really care about this one a lot. It's a very common set of reactions. You can also see changes in appetite or eating. Now, the adjustment reactions that I've already gone over, including many of the others, are not specific to the pandemic. And it can actually be difficult to determine precisely what's the cause of the reaction. For example, sleep problems is very common during this pandemic, as it is in most crisis events. Okay, so let me just go back to the fact that I was talking about difficulty sleeping and how that's a common reaction. And for
Yes.
that reaction, as well as many of the ones that I've already mentioned and will mention, it may be difficult to sort out what exactly is the cause. So, for example, a lot of kids have been staying up late during the pandemic, particularly when they were in virtual classes. And parents would say to me, is this, they're having panic attacks? Are they afraid to go to sleep? Are they anxious? Are they having insomnia? Or are they teenagers and they're just like staying up late? And the bottom line is sometimes you can't really tell. So I try and focus on why are they staying up? And more importantly, what functional impact does that have? Now, if you could remember back to 2 years ago, if you said to a teenager, what would you do if you had to stay home with your parents inside the house and couldn't leave for a year? I don't think anybody would ever think that that's a question that you would ask anyone, but that's actually about what happened. So if you're in that situation, it obviously feels very close quarters. And so kids may actually decide to shift their sleep schedule in order to get a little bit of social distancing when they can't physically distance from their parents. So their parents, other adults in the household go to sleep, and then they stay up for several hours later. That allows them to feel like they have some alone time, even when they can't be physically alone. And then they sleep in the next morning when the adults wake up. And then that gives them a couple more hours where there's some distancing. The advantage to that is it allows them some privacy. It gives them a chance when they can text and communicate with their friends, feeling like they're not home. The problem is that sometimes they disrupt the adults who are sleeping through their being still up. And the flip side can happen is that the adults, when they wake up in the morning, can wake up the kids. But more importantly, you can also find that kids are having difficulty getting up in time for even their virtual lessons, or obviously getting up in time to attend class in person. Or they may not have enough time to do their homework during daylight. And if they're just texting friends late at night, they're probably not doing their homework then either. So what I do is I focus on the functional significance of it. I don't try to argue with kids that it's normal or abnormal or unhealthy, because what you're likely to get from them is everybody's staying up late. Like, if it is normal, all the kids are doing it. And that's not really the key point. The key point is if it's causing a functional problem. If it means that they're not getting to class on time, not participating in online classes, or not finishing their homework, then it's a problem. So I focus on the functional significance of the behavior and try not to get into arguments about what's normal or abnormal. And I would approach that for almost all the things that I'm talking about, because there's not a lot of what happens during a pandemic is not actually what normally would happen, but that doesn't mean it isn't functionally appropriate for the context. Now, you can also see kids having difficulty with concentration, and that has obvious impact on their academic performance. And for older kids who work and adults, that can impact their work performance. You can also see sadness and depression. And the key point is to differentiate between the two, to figure out, are they just sad because something very sad is happening in their community and in the country and in the world as a whole? Or do they have clinical depression, which is still a problem even in the midst of the pandemic? And that's what we try and figure out the difference about. I can't tell you the number of people who have said to me that, morale is poor during the pandemic at their workplace, in their school, or in their office building. My response to that usually is, well, there are many people dying. It's a very tragic situation. I wouldn't really expect morale to be very good during this. It's not a problem if people are sad when sad events occur. as a problem when it's clinically significant depression. You can also see anger or irritability in individuals when they're highly stressed, and you may see distrust and suspiciousness. And those reactions can challenge pre-existing relationships among friends, colleagues, and family members. And it makes it particularly hard to form new relationships. So the start of a new school year can be particularly difficult if kids are angry, irritable, distrusting, and suspicious. You can also see an increase in or new onset of alcohol and other substance use. And I see that in both kids and adults. I remember that I was responding to an earthquake in Sichuan province in China some years ago. There were about 69,000 people that died in one day. And a lot of the schools collapsed because of the poor construction. And I was visiting with the staff at one school, and this particular school was a middle school that had collapsed. I think about 30 to 40% of the students and staff died when the building collapsed, and the others were basically dug out alive from the rubble. And so they were part of a large area that had to physically relocate to a resettlement community. And the staff were standing in a tent in this resettlement community. So I asked the teacher how the kids were doing. It had been several weeks since the earthquake. And he said these were middle school kids, and they were essentially smoking more tobacco. That's what they were aware of. And then I asked the teacher, how are you doing? And even though he was standing right next to his principal, he didn't even pause. And he just said, I sleep every night to fall asleep. You see the same thing among professionals. And obviously adults as even when they're not in professional positions. I remember when I went to New Orleans for one visit after Katrina, it was probably like about a couple months after Katrina. And I was going over this with a group of people at a training. And afterwards, one of the school mental health providers who was hosting my visit kind of confided in me on the way home from the presentation. She said, it's about 3 weeks after Katrina, and my daughter called me on my cell phone one afternoon to ask where I was. And I said, you know what, I'm with friends from school. We're at happy hour at a bar nearby. And apparently she just said, Mom, you've been in happy hour every day since Katrina, and you really don't seem happy to me at all. And she said, I realized then that I was drinking too much. And so I spend a lot of time on this because not so much that it's the predominant type of reaction that you'll see in children, but it's a common reaction that you'll see in adults, which obviously has impact on the kids in the household. You can also see physical symptoms like headaches or stomach aches or fatigue, and that can be due to a range of different reasons. One is it can be just psychological distress. People who are emotionally upset often present with physical complaints. But the stress hormones themselves have physiological effects on the human body. So it can cause increase in asthma attacks in individuals who are susceptible. It can also cause increase in glucose levels for individuals with diabetes, and it can increase hypertension in individuals as well. So you may see if you have someone, for example, who's having trouble breathing, having respiratory distress, they could be having a panic attack that presents as a physical complaint. They could be having an asthma attack if they're susceptible to asthma and the stress hormones are making it worse, or they could have COVID-19 that's causing the respiratory distress itself. And unfortunately, they can have a combination of the above. So physical symptoms is something we should be looking for. And so please thank the school nurse as soon as you see him or her. It's a really tough position to be in right now, and a very busy one as well. Next on this list is grief. I'm going to come back to that later, so I'm just going to skip that for now. And then we have guilt. People somehow manage to find reasons to feel guilty in crisis events or after someone has died, irrespective of really what their experience and role was in the event. And this is seen both after a crisis as well as after the death of someone that is a close family member or friend. At some level, at least unconsciously, it may seem easier initially during the pandemic to feel responsible for something you did, didn't do, or should have done to prevent someone you care about from getting infected, becoming ill, or having a serious outcome from the illness, rather than to accept the alternative, which is you had nothing to do with it. Because if it had nothing to do with you or what you did or didn't do, that means it's unlikely you're going to be able to prevent it from happening again. And when someone you care about dies or experiences, a traumatic event, We often worry whether that's going to happen to someone else we care about. And you have some initial relief from that anxiety if you can somehow reassure yourself that you actually can control what happens. But that's really just an illusion of control in most situations. So it doesn't prevent individuals from getting sick or dying. And it does leave them with guilt, which makes it hard to deal with the adjustment to the reactions of what's happened. So it's not a good coping mechanism, but it's one that's common. So children who experience the death of a family member during this pandemic are likely to question how they may have inadvertently exposed the family member to the virus, how they should have picked up on symptoms earlier before it became more serious, or even wondered what they could have done to make sure they got more or better care once they were ill. And I will get back to this later, but a lot of the fear-based messages that we use are just going to make this worse. When somebody dies or gets very ill, people often wonder, as I said, whether they are at fault. But we actually told kids that they will, and this was early on in the pandemic, I think when we knew less, that they're unlikely to become ill themselves. But if they go out and socialize with others, they are likely to be an asymptomatic carrier, and they may actually result in the death of someone, an elderly person that they're related to. And I remember some politician said, every time you go out to meet with your friends, visualize your grandmother and realize you might kill her by mistake. Well, then when the grandmother does die, obviously these kids are going to feel guilty. And so I'll come back to the problems with fear-based messaging, and this is just one of them. But you can also see survivor guilt, or guilt for people not having experienced loss or trauma like they perceive other people do. So there's a lot of guilt that goes around. Now, all of the reactions that I just talked about on this slide may be due to the pandemic itself, but they can also be due to a wide range of other stressors associated with the pandemic. So there might be financial impact of unemployment or partial employment, and that can cause concerns among family members, and the kids pick up on that. Or it may even increase arguments related to finances among the adults in the household. It can worsen parental anxiety, depression, or other mental illness, or substance use, or it may worsen domestic violence. So my general advice to people is during the pandemic, don't just ask whether children have had a family member who became ill or died, but ask them more broadly about how they're doing. Because there's a lot of stressors that are occurring that are not directly from the virus itself, but follow from the fact that we've been having a pandemic. Now, during this time, we should all be watching our media consumption. Make sure it's a healthy diet and don't consume too much of it. Adults should try to keep informed, but through focus and periodic attention to trusted media outlets or other trusted sources of information. Don't listen to, watch, or read continual coverage. I find it helpful to remind myself and others that there really are only two main reasons to listen to, watch, or read media coverage during a crisis event. One is to be reassured, and the other is to learn practical steps to keep yourself or those you care about safe. So if you're reading the news or watching it or looking at social media, and you're finding out about things that are not reassuring, there's another variant that's come out. There are breakthrough infections that have led to deaths of famous people. People are still dying at a significant rate. If all it's doing is upsetting you and you're not learning anything practical to do, you already have been informed and know that it's important to become vaccinated when you're able to, that you should keep a mask on when you're near people, that you should keep at a physical distance when possible, that, if you already know, it's important to wash your hands. I think most people have gotten that down by now. I haven't really seen much new that's come out recently. So if you already know all of that and you're just getting upset because of more media coverage, then just stop watching for a while. And so just to disconnect from all media, television, radio, print, and social media, at least for a period of time. You should advise your children and other adults to also limit their amount of media exposure during a crisis event. And it's actually just a good time to unplug and connect with family and friends, whether you can do that in person, ideally, if that's possible, such as if they live in the same household, or you can connect with them remotely, if that's the only way to do it safely. So with that kind of background about some of the problems, let me turn now to some basic advice on how do we talk to and support children during the pandemic. And I'm getting close to about halfway done with my presentation. So what I'm going to ask you to do is start entering questions in the chat if you're able to do that, so that we have some questions collected for when I break and turn to the question part. So the first thing is, don't pretend that everything is okay when obviously it isn't now. Children pick up when parents and other adults are not being genuine and honest, and they're going to be less likely to ask questions or seek advice if that's the case. Children actually benefit from knowing that adults in their lives, such as educators and parents, have similar or at least their own concerns, and learn from those adults how to deal effectively with troubling or distressing feelings. We simply can't expect children to share all their concerns when we're unwilling to admit we even have concerns ourselves. And we certainly can't help them learn how to cope with distress effectively if we never model effective coping techniques for them. But that doesn't mean that adults should share all of their concerns. Some concerns are primarily those of adults, such as related to the financial impact of the pandemic, and parents are best to discuss those concerns privately. Adults, though, should briefly share their reactions in the service of being able to model effective coping strategies. For example, let's say you're a classroom educator and your classroom or your pod had a case exposure, and so you have to quarantine for a period of time and it's time to return back to in-person classes. You could say as a classroom educator that you're really excited to be back with students and glad that all of them are healthy, but that actually, to be honest, it was a little hard for you to sleep last night because although you were excited about coming back to class, you were also a little worried about becoming infected. And then you talked with your wife about it this morning, and your wife explained all the steps that we're taking to keep ourselves safe and reminded us of the steps that are in place in the school to decrease the risk of transmission. And just talking about it helped you feel a little bit better. So you're modeling talking and processing feelings, and you're really just mentioning that you had distress. So you have the opportunity to model that coping strategy. And I'll get to other coping strategies later. You also, before you try and reassure children, you want to ask them first, what are they afraid of? What are their concerns? Why are they skeptical? Children tend to have very different fears or concerns than adults do. And you can't reassure people if you don't know what they personally are afraid of or concerned about. Otherwise, you probably aren't offering reassurance, but rather you're just telling them why you aren't worried. Not why they shouldn't be worried, but why you aren't worried. And when two people each talk only from their own perspective, I call that arguing, and arguing is not a very effective means of providing reassurance. We shouldn't tell children also that they shouldn't be worried or attempt to minimize their concerns. If they're scared, they're scared. And telling them they shouldn't be scared isn't going to make them less scared. Instead, what we need to do is help them learn how to deal with their uncertainty and fear and share with them strategies to deal with distressing feelings rather than pretend that they don't or shouldn't exist. You should be sure to include positive or reassuring information and overall present a hopeful perspective. For example, I would refer to the past year and a half as a very challenging period that we'll help each other adapt to, rather than referring to it as a lost year and a half, which has resulted in lifelong damage and will lead to a tsunami of mental illness, the way I see it projected in the media often. I wanted to come back to the issue of fear-based messaging. I would recommend we avoid using fear-based approaches to try and make children do what we think they need to do. It's true that people need to feel some degree of risk in order to take preventive actions, but excessive fear is actually counterproductive. It can lead to a sense of fatalism, which just prompts people to stop using risk prevention measures. So if they conclude that these germs are everywhere, I mean, we said it's on the mail, it's on the food, it's on packages, it's on doorknobs. Well, you can't avoid touching everything, people and inanimate objects for a year and a half. So I think some people just become fatalistic and say, look, if it's on everything and we're supposed to believe that it's in everyone and on every surface, then I give up. Like, I'm not going to be able to avoid that any longer. And we don't want people to feel a sense of fatalism. We want them to feel there are steps they can continue to take to decrease their risks. Individuals who've been told a lot of frightening messages will start to discredit risks if they feel that one risk has been false or exaggerated. So they may think, for example, one of the school staff had COVID and I didn't wash my hands that day in school and I'm still okay. So all these recommendations are obviously just exaggerations, and I'm not going to believe any of them. What we have to do is not present risks as absolute, but rather we have to introduce the concept of relative risk. No, we can't decrease the risk of transmission of a virus that's circulating in the community in a school setting to zero, but we can reduce it a lot. And we can do that through fairly simple, practical steps like using masks and physical distance and hand washing before eating or periodically throughout the day. Those are reasonable protective steps to take, and although they don't decrease the risk to zero, they decrease it a lot, enough that it's worth doing. So I think it's just important that we explain to people that, yes, you can find someone who was fully vaccinated who died of COVID, as was just in the news last night. But the actual risk of dying once you're vaccinated is very much reduced, particularly for younger and healthier people. Another problem with fear-based messaging is what we call reactive risk-taking and counterphobic behavior. Some people may become so scared and they will believe that it's inevitable that they will be placed in the risky situation, that they may feel they have to place themselves in that situation in order to prove that they will survive it. And this is probably one of the reasons why older children experiment with risky behaviors. It's not that they believe themselves to be invulnerable, rather they don't want to be vulnerable. It's overwhelming with them feeling vulnerable. So they have to try and confront it by risk-taking. And it may be one of the reasons why I haven't heard about it recently, but early on, before we had vaccines, I think there were stories about COVID parties where youth and young adults would attend a party where they knew someone was infected. This was before vaccines. And they bet to see who was going to become sick first. And you would ask, well, why would anyone do that? And I think some people say, well, they must just not realize they could become ill. That doesn't make any sense. Why would you vote to see or bet to see who's going to get sick first if you didn't think anyone was going to get sick? But what's happening in that situation sometimes is people just, they get to the point and they say, well, I know I'm going to have to be with friends and I'm going to need to be with people, and there's no way I can wait. So if I'm going to be exposed to it, let me just get exposed to it now, and then I can prove that I'm okay. And that will make me feel reassured. The problem is if you're exposed once to the virus and you don't become sick, that doesn't mean you won't get sick the next time you're exposed. And so it's not a logical approach, and it's not a good coping mechanism because it's unsafe, but it does explain a little bit about some of the dangers of just frightening people too much. And I think personally that early on in the pandemic in general, we used a lot too much fear-based messages. And there's this tendency to say, well, look at their behavior. They must not realize how serious it is. So I'm just going to make them more scared. And unfortunately, sometimes that just makes matters worse. I would also be cautious about introducing other risks as a comparison in the context of the pandemic. So trying to reassure people by telling them it could be worse and that more people have died from car accidents, for example, or heart disease, is just likely to make them think it's going to get worse, and that they also have to worry now about car accidents and heart disease. So it isn't really reassuring. And so I understand why some people try that. But saying to them, look, you have a greater risk of dying from driving in a car, does it really make you feel safer about being around someone who has COVID? So really what we want to do, instead of just frightening kids, is explore with them different strategies of dealing with distress, discomfort, anxiety, and sadness. And that might include things like reading or hobbies to promote healthy distraction. But it may also include talking with others, journaling, blogging, art, and music, and other ways to promote the expression of feelings. You have to do both. Sometimes it's helpful to step aside from what's bothering you to relax, and other times you have to confront it and process those feelings. The problem is you may be stuck at home with someone for a long period of time during this pandemic, and you might want to talk, and they might want to be distracted. And that's not a great combination. And so, I remember talking to one couple, the child had died, and one parent, the husband, enjoyed distraction through exercise and jogging, and the wife wanted to talk about her feelings. And so she looked at me and she said, my husband is figuratively and literally running away from me. And we had to talk about that because there did have to be a time where they came together. And so, he could just say to his wife, I'm going to go jogging to clear my mind. Do you want to talk before I go? Or can we just talk when I get back? They just have to figure out how they can meet in the middle from time to time and otherwise respect that the other person has a legitimate and an appropriate coping technique, even though it's very different from the one you've chosen. I've listed some other things that you can do, like exercise and yoga, the appropriate use of respectful humor, and relaxation techniques and mindfulness, and those can be taught to even very young children. We can also help children identify developmentally appropriate steps they can take personally to protect their own health, as well as to help others. For younger children, for example, let them provide input into their own preventative steps for their own health, such as figuring out their hand washing routine. Now, I always hesitate to bring this up because I don't like to be critical and I don't know who came up with this suggestion, but to be quite honest, if you have to celebrate your birthday during this pandemic, which at this point is essentially everyone in the world, then probably the last thing you want to sing every time you wash your hands is happy birthday, because most people had a birthday that just wasn't as good as it had been when they could get together with family and friends for celebrations. So let them pick what they want to do. And also help kids identify ways they can safely help others, even if it's just making regular phone calls to grandparents who are feeling somewhat isolated, or finding ways, because finding ways to help others gives you a sense of agency during a time when many of us are just feeling powerless, and that will help with recovery. Now, I've been talking about how to help kids in general, what we call universal support. But we need to acknowledge that some kids are going to need additional help. The pandemic and discussion about the impact it's having on families may remind people of other difficulties in their lives, whether that be events in the past, ongoing challenges such as racial inequalities, or concerns about future losses or crises. And these children may find it to be a particularly difficult time and benefit from some more support. Children who were anxious, or depression prior to the pandemic will benefit from getting additional support from their mental health providers and their healthcare providers. So what you should do is encourage them to reach out and resume some of that counseling and assistance, even if it's done remotely. We also need to recognize that when people are highly stressed, they may regress socially. They can just act less mature, become more demanding or selfish, or have more difficulty getting along with peers or family members. You may find some teenagers appear disinterested and say that it doesn't really matter to them what happens and they're not worried about it, because in part they're just overwhelmed with their own concerns. And they may need to focus first on their own needs. What does it mean for their college or career plans, their vacations, sports, hobbies, and friendships? They may need to focus on that before they're able to even start to think of the needs of others. This is often a sign that they're under a great deal of stress and having difficulty coping. So if you can imagine, let's say a teenager is complaining because they can't resume soccer practice with their team or with their friends. And parents are like, well, it hasn't started up in school yet, and you just have to wait. And they say, well, you don't really appreciate how difficult this is for me. This is the most important years for me to learn how to play soccer. I'm never going to be able to go back and make up for it. And I think it's stupid that we can't play soccer. I mean, the NFL has started their games and that's a contact sport. Soccer, you don't even touch people. It's always done outdoors and you don't even touch the ball. So there's no way you could get COVID from it. And people are just making a big deal out of it and it's unnecessary. You can imagine this kind of argument going on. And finally, the parent gets frustrated and says, well, you know what, you should be happy. There are some families who have experienced deaths of people that they love, and you just can't play soccer, which seems pretty minor compared to that. Well, when you say that, it doesn't make it any better that they can't play soccer. They're still going to be disappointed, but now they're just going to feel guilty that they were being selfish. And so they may talk less about their concerns, but only because they don't feel that you're receptive to hearing them, because you've just embarrassed them and made them feel guilty. It's kind of like I remember as a kid, common argument was, you should appreciate the fact that there are people starving in other continents. And that didn't really actually make the meal taste any better to me. And my reaction was always, then please send them this meal. I don't like it. Maybe they will. That seems to be a win-win situation. And that wasn't really, the appropriate solution. So the bottom line is try not to make people feel guilty for being self-centered when they're under distress. And the reason I think adults do this is not because they logically think through that this is the best way, but because they are also stressed themselves. And so they get frustrated. And a lot of times people tell me crisis response brings out the best in people. But I've done this work for over 30 years, and I will tell you in general, it brings out their distress. Yes, there are people, you'll hear and see examples of heroism and selflessness, but they tend to stand out. And they stand out because most people who are distressed are actually needy, demanding, self-centered, or just not fun or particularly satisfying to be with. I think that happens to all of us during this pandemic at one point or another. So we need to be patient with children, with colleagues, and above all, you have to be patient with yourself. Now, this pandemic is causing widespread distress among both children and adults. And I hear a lot of people talking about the trauma of this pandemic. But the challenges facing most children at this point are probably related more to loss than they are to trauma itself. Our society has talked a lot about and appreciated the important impact of trauma on children, and you'll hear a lot about being trauma informed. But as a country, we have been slow to recognize we also have to be grief sensitive. I was talking with a teenager. He had been in a community site where there was a mass shooting, and the person on either side of him was shot and killed. He declined any counseling, only came to school once in the next 3 weeks, and people were concerned about him. So I went and visited him at his home, and I asked, why aren't you going for counseling? And he said, I had some trauma symptoms for about a week. It was jittery, I had some nightmares, I felt anxious when I was by myself. And he goes, but those all went away in about a week. I said, well, then why aren't you at school? And he said, I was there, I went once, but it didn't feel right being there without her. Well, the person on either side of him was shot and killed, and that included his girlfriend that he was on a date with, that he planned on marrying. And he said, being at school without her just felt wrong. So I looked at him and I said, well, maybe you're grieving the death of your girlfriend. And he looked surprised because no one had suggested that for 3 weeks. And he just said, that's it. And if someone is ready to talk to me about that, I'll go for counseling tonight. I just don't want to keep talking about the shooting. So a lot of times we overlook that grief is really part of the problem. And the interventions and the supports that we offer grieving individuals are very different from trauma treatment. At a very basic level, when you're addressing trauma, you're focusing on the person's reactions to something that happened. But support for grief focuses on helping children cope with the persistent absence of a person, coping with loss, rather than the way the person died. So they're not coping with an event, they're coping with the absence of someone important to them. And so that can cause us to give the wrong type of support in situations where grief is occurring. So I was on the Sandy Hook Advisory Commission, and one of the parents came to testify, and she said that when she got the yearbook at the end of the school year, she opened it up and she noticed that the picture of her child who had been killed wasn't present. And she said they had removed the pictures of all the children and staff that died that day. And she said it was as if they never existed. And she asked, why would anyone do that? I didn't speak to the folks in the yearbook at Sandy Hook per se, but I have spoken to other schools that have similarly removed pictures of individuals who have died. And they say they don't want trauma triggers. But the issue is with grief, you don't want a grief trigger, but it's even worse to forget the person that died. So that's why we go to cemeteries. That's why we have funerals. That's why we talk about and remember people that have died, that even though it has some discomfort with it, it's important for us to maintain those connections. So what we want to do is make sure that people do provide support to individuals who are grieving. So what I'm going to do is ask if anybody has some questions. We'll stop just in a couple minutes to ask some questions before I can go on and talk a little bit more about grief. But I just wanted to start by saying that what we want to do is to make sure that individuals in schools are sensitive to the needs of grieving individuals we're not expecting them to provide grief counseling. Educators are not expected to do that. And I think the distinction was made very well in my conversation with one classroom teacher. She had a student who was out for a week while his mother was hospitalized. And when he came back, she found out the mother had died during the hospitalization. And she gave him a hug, said she was very sorry, and asked how she could be of help. And he got embarrassed and just said, please, let's not do this. And so she said, okay, but just know I'm here and you can come and talk to me after class or after school. My door's always open. We all are here for you. But he didn't come back to talk with her. But he did stop by after school to thank her. When she asked why, he said, you were here and I didn't have to talk about it. And she said, I realize then sometimes kids don't want to talk about it, but they need to know we know and we need to provide them support. And she said, it's kind of like a dance. I take the first step. If the child's ready and takes the next step, that's fine. We continue the dance. But if they're not ready, that's okay too. We can just stop and listen to the music together. And I think a lot of what we're going to be doing is just listening to the music together, just being with kids who are stressed, who are experiencing grief, and try and provide them supports and assistance. At the same time, we're acknowledging that loss. So before I go on and talk a little bit more about how to deal with grief itself, let me see if anybody has any questions.
It looks like we had a question in the chat.
Okay.
They said, with all the various traumatic events you consulted on in the past, have you noticed any differences or patterns in how children are responding with the current pandemic?
Yes, that's a great question. Well, one of the issues is that, because I remember being asked a question in New Orleans after Katrina, it was about 6 months afterwards, and they said, when do you think the kids are going to get over this? And I said, many kids are still homeless. It's not over for them. You can't adjust to something until it ends. And you can adjust and cope with something as it's happening, but you can't recover from it while it's still ongoing. And this pandemic obviously is still ongoing. And so as a result, I think we keep talking about how we're in the recovery phase, when really for many people, it's still the response phase. So that's one of the main differences, is the duration of this crisis, that it keeps on going. And as a result, so do a lot of the reactions. I remember, maybe about 6 or 9 months ago, I said, this was a quote that related more to, I think it was a war situation, that we weren't at the end. We were not even at the beginning of the end, but perhaps we were at the end of the beginning. So right when vaccines started to come out, I said, I think we might be at the end of the beginning, but I don't know when this is going to end. And so that's part of what's just so frustrating and exhausting, is that we're just not done with it yet. It's still continuing. So it is better. We have vaccines, but deaths are still occurring. People are still getting sick, and there's still new things that we learn that we don't understand. And as a result, an unresolved crisis is still a crisis. So I would say that's probably one of the main differences. And then I think if I look at other types of crisis events, there's much more polarization of individuals, much more kind of anger and hostility and conflict. Now, I see that after other crisis events like mass shootings and stabbings, for example. There will often be differences of opinion, and people will feel very strongly about their opinion and attack other people who have differences of opinion. It's kind of like in a crisis situation, part of what's so overwhelming is you feel out of control. So as soon as people start to feel like they have some control, they will feel very strongly about what they should and should not do. And those usually evolve around things like use of money and finances. Safety is a very big issue. And so back in like March of 2020, I was telling people, as soon as people feel like they can get out of their home safely, they're going to start arguing about what they think they can and can't do. So this whole issue of, whether or not you wear a mask, whether or not you get vaccinated, it starts to become very emotional. And I think it's the same type of reaction I see in other crisis events, but it's almost like on steroids, because it's lasted so long and it's had impact on so many people. And part of what's also very different about this is it's a global pandemic, which I know we all know, but usually when there's a pandemic, or when there's, I should say, when there's another crisis, people who aren't impacted by the crisis come and help. Well, there's nobody who's not impacted by this crisis. I remember talking to one school system in an area that, resisted mask mandates and other things. And they had this plan that if, the hospitalization rates increased again, they would just get more traveling healthcare providers and surge up. And I just said to them, where do you think they're going to come from? Because it's now all over the world. There isn't a group of healthy healthcare providers who just are looking for a place to relocate to. So I think that's the other thing so it's the duration, it's the amount of polarization and anger and disagreement and conflict. And it's also the fact that it's just affect everyone and everything. So there isn't a way to get away from it. And there aren't people who haven't been impacted who have kind of the reserves and the capacity to help in the same way. So I don't know if there were any other questions before I go on.
I have a question that was submitted is how to deal with the grief of loss of friendships due to lack of socialization opportunities stemming from the pandemic.
Right. So when I talk about grief, I was going to also share that there is the grief from death that occurs, and that's called bereavement. But there's also the grief that occurs from it's non-death related, the loss of opportunities, the loss of a sense of safety, the disruption in celebrations, kind of this like lost opportunities that you hear people talking about. And I think that's very real. People do have strong feelings about other types of losses that occur. I do think some parents have perhaps overstated this. Yes, kids would be disappointed if they can't go to graduation. A lot of people say, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity and they will never get that back. And yes, that is true, but kids also miss graduation because they had to have their appendix out that day, or because they had an opportunity to go with their family to Africa for sabbatical. I mean, there are other reasons that we miss some of these events. And if those reasons are positive, like getting to go on sabbatical or visit another country or have a once in a lifetime trip, people often choose that and just say, it's disappointing, but I'll be okay. I went into a combined bachelor's and MD program. And so that was set up to do it in 6 years. And so I didn't have a college graduation. I graduated from medical school. And then the next day I got my college degree. And my life was full because that was a choice that I made. And it didn't bother me that I missed graduation. So I think we need to allow and acknowledge that people have those losses and that they are meaningful to them. But as a parent, you don't need to feel that somehow your child is damaged as a result or will never recover from that. Those type of things are usually things that you can adjust to, particularly when everyone else is in the same situation. So I think the real issue is that we can't make this pandemic go away. We can't keep our kids 100% safe. We can't give them everything we want. And that's frustrating and it is disappointing, but it isn't necessarily something that will, be devastating to them, just upsetting. Do you want me to go on with the other part of the presentation? And then people can add.
I'll
Okay.
ask the questions at the end of the presentation.
All right, so let me turn back to kind of grief in kids. So the first thing that you want to do is acknowledge the loss when you're with someone in distress. But many people, children and adults, are afraid they're going to say the wrong thing with someone who's grieving. This is after death has occurred. So I'll go over some of the well-intentioned comments that might not be the best to say to children or adults who are grieving. The first thing is, don't try and cheer up people who are grieving by making statements such as, I know it hurts very much right now, but you're going to feel better in a short period of time. Allow them to have their grief and allow it to take the time it takes. I tell people anything that begins with at least should probably be reconsidered. At least he isn't in pain anymore, or at least you still have a sister. Those are really techniques or statements that people make when they're observing grief and they don't like observing it. So they want people to stop expressing their grief. It doesn't make the people not grieve, it just makes them hide it so that they can protect you. And really, you don't want to encourage them to be strong or cover up their emotions. You should feel free to express your own feelings and demonstrate empathy, but don't state you know exactly how someone else feels. So avoid statements like, I know exactly what you're going through, because unless they tell you what they're going through, you don't really know how they feel. You don't want to say things like, you must be angry. Let them express their own feelings and don't tell them how they ought to feel. It's also best if you're talking to someone else that isn't your own child, to avoid sharing your personal loss experiences and keep the focus on the grieving child and that person's experience. If it is your own child, you may have a mutual loss and want to provide mutual comfort to each other, and that's perfectly okay. But I would say if you're a teacher or someone, you're really there to support the kid, and what the kid needs is really all about them. What you want to do is allow the child to be upset and try not to judge it, but intervene if safety or health is a concern. So let me, what I thought I would do is just go over some of the unique challenges of supporting grieving kids during this pandemic and tell you some resources that you can find to address this. After the death of someone close, it's very common for children and adults to worry about others, the health of themselves and others they care about. And in the setting of a pandemic, it's really hard to tell people that everyone's safe and unlikely to die. So it becomes important, no matter what the cause of the death is, to help children deal with their fears and concerns about the pandemic in addition to their grief. And so we have some COVID-19 pandemic resources on our webpage of the Coalition website and the National Center's website. There's just a banner at the top I'll show you, and you just click on it. And that includes presentations for educators, parents, and other professionals on how to talk to and support kids during a pandemic. Physical distancing measures, including but not just lengthy school closures, increases social isolation, which we see in people who are grieving. They often feel socially isolated. Well, now they're also physically isolated. And it just makes it hard to provide support using the ways we normally provide support for grieving kids. And secondary losses become even more of an issue. When someone dies, we lose the person. We call that the primary loss. But we also lose everything that person did, could have done, or might have done for us in the future. Those are the secondary losses. And those become even more marked in a pandemic where we're relying on caregivers to do so much because of the physical distancing and all of the stressors that occur during the pandemic. And family members can be overwhelmed by the pandemic in addition to their own grief and may not be available even to provide remote support to family as they might have. And as I mentioned, some grief may actually be due not to death, but to other types of losses. And the last thing I was going to say about the grief during the pandemic is that supporting grieving children is difficult in the best of times. And obviously this is not the best of times. So this is a really important time that we make sure as adults that we take care of ourselves. So I wanted to talk a little bit about acknowledging our own continuing reactions to this pandemic. It's expected that, as I mentioned, that people will have new or persisting fears, anxieties, and uncertainties because the pandemic isn't over. People are still getting sick and some people are still dying. And there are new changes that occur that remind us that there are things we don't know and things that can change to disrupt things further. There's also a lot of irritability just from numerous daily hassles. I went to a conference out of state and I needed to change my a flight the following week, but I wasn't able to do that online. It kept telling me I had to call and speak to someone. So I called the airline and a recording that every 15 or 20 seconds reminded me I could use the website and not wait on the phone, except I couldn't use the website. So that was actually just very annoying. But it projected that the wait was at least 3 hours and it did not offer to call me back. So I was speaking at the conference within 3 hours, so I couldn't do that. So I got up really early the next day and I called back and the estimate was that the wait would be over 9 hours. Well, I mean, people can't wait on the phone for 9 hours. And so what you're just finding is all of these disruptions in people who are not able to cover jobs in the same way, or there's supply shortages, it just wears you down. And you may feel guilty for being upset when obviously whether or not you can get a flight changed is nothing compared to whether or not you experience the death of someone that you care about. But the problem is people are experiencing both. And these hassles, the daily hassles, just wear on you and make you more irritable. I also see widespread exhaustion, both physical and emotional, among adults. And then there's this, you lose familiarity with routines that you haven't followed for an extended period of time. And then just going back to your office just requires more mental effort and considerably more time. And then there can be disappointment that's experienced when activities that were prohibited for a long period of time now become possible. I remember when I was finally fully vaccinated and concluded it was safe to go back into a grocery store. And it had been about a year. I was really excited. And I was like, I get to go back in the grocery store. I'm stopping at the store where I can get my favorite cereal that was hard to get online. And my wife, who wasn't fully vaccinated, waited in the car. And when I came back to the car, she said, what was it like now that you finally went to a grocery store? And I looked at her and I said, you know what? I realized in about 1 minute after I entered, I don't like grocery shopping. I never found it exciting. And it really was still boring. But now I was wearing a mask and trying to keep away from people. So it was actually worse than boring. I've seen this too when I've gone to conferences. I've gone to just a couple, and people are there because this is the vacation they've waited for a year. But they don't have people to clean the hotel rooms. There's a long wait for food. They don't have the same service. Things are really expensive in some places. And it's just this, they get angry. They get angry because it's just not as good as what they thought it would be. In part, it may not have been that good even beforehand, but also going back to normal, it isn't normal yet. So maybe kids are excited about going back to school, but it just doesn't feel normal because people are wearing masks and keeping a distance, and it just doesn't, it isn't the same as it was before. And then many people are just experiencing frustration over the continued conflict and polarization, as I mentioned. And then there's still grief that persists. And then, of course, there are other problems that often just seem overlooked. Maybe you're getting divorced. Maybe you have a relative with major depression. Maybe you've been diagnosed with cancer. But when everybody's talking about COVID 24/7, if it's not a death from COVID, it might just not seem as important to people. And then you feel like your stressor is not valid, and that can make it worse. So there's a lot that's still stressful and upsetting. So people are most likely to feel overwhelmed, including educators, because I see a question on how to support our teachers, if they feel unprepared or unable or unprepared to provide meaningful assistance. But there's actually a lot we can do even in the midst of an evolving pandemic. We can acknowledge the limitations in our current knowledge and resources, but we shouldn't minimize the value of the support that we can provide. Just because we don't know everything doesn't mean we know nothing of value. And educators, parents, you all know strategies to decrease children's distress, and you should try some of them now. You may not think it's enough, and in some cases, it probably won't be. And then you reach out to people in the school district and community or your child's pediatrician when you feel more is needed. But all of us should at least recognize and celebrate the positive contributions you can and do make. The moments that you help teach a child something that they didn't know before and give them a sense of accomplishment, or when you help them deal with a problem, even if it's not their biggest problem, and they've got other big problems remaining, we still made it better. And so part of what we have to do, well, I encourage parents, by the way, if you're asking about how to support teachers, tell them what's working. Tell them what they did that your child appreciated or that you appreciated. We also need to set reasonable expectations and communicate that to kids. They're just not going to learn as much schoolwork during this time period as they would have had we been able to keep schools in session and we weren't in crisis. So it's not just that they weren't in school buildings, it's that they were in crisis. People were dying in large numbers. I've been to schools after mass shootings, after large-scale natural disasters, and they often open up the next day even, but kids still don't learn well and teachers still have trouble teaching. So we shouldn't try to keep the same pace of learning as pre-pandemic, or it's just going to overwhelm students and educators. And then their time together becomes a source of distress instead of support. And one of the things I was telling people starting in March of 2020 is recognize that when schools do resume fully and the pandemic is behind us, kids aren't going to be able to catch up and learn everything they missed. And you know what? That's okay. At some level, the world and therefore the curriculum had to change. And if we're teaching kids how to cope with distress and adjust to a crisis, we're actually teaching them life skills that make them more resilient in the future and more capable of dealing with future adversity. And that's really, to be frank, the most important lessons they can learn. But it does underscore the need for self-care. So the last thing I wanted to touch on was just some self-care issues for yourself. So part of what I hear is it's hard to make time when there's so much to do and your children and everyone else needs your help. And I tell people, I've often lost time, but I've actually never found it anywhere. You have to make the time rather than wait to find it. You may feel shame or guilt for attending to your own needs ahead of those of others. And just recognize you're not putting your personal needs ahead of others, but rather you're taking care of your needs so you have the capacity to continue to help others. There's often an assumption that others are having less trouble adjusting than you are. I mentioned kids can hide their distress, adults hide it even better, and people in leadership positions hide it often incredibly well. But this is not a superpower, it's a problem. And we need to be able to recognize that people are in more distress than they actually appear to be, and that we should be providing support and accepting support as a result. And then there's a lack of modeling of professional self-care by those around you. So practice your self-care and share what you're doing so that you can encourage others. Those who want more information can contact the National Center or look at the website for the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. See, there's a banner at the top that's salmon colored, and that'll take you to the COVID-19 resources webpage. And then I just wanted to mention the Coalition to Support Grieving Students. I just have a couple slides on this before I end. And the Coalition is a unique collaboration of the leading professional organizations representing classroom educators, the AFT and NEA, the two teachers unions were founding members, school administrators and superintendents and principal associations, student support personnel, including school counselors, nurses, psychologists, and social workers. A lot of others came together back about 7 years ago to create the information on the Coalition website. And since we launched the website, actually more than 100 other organizations have joined, including, for example, the National PTA, but also Boys and Girls Club of America, American School Health Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics. It's really a long list. And we created this free school practitioner-oriented website, grievingstudents.kids, that has over 20 free video-based training modules, most of which are quite brief. We also have written material for different groups, including parents. So here's a booklet, After a Loved One Dies, which goes over some practical information. And that's now been translated into several languages, and we hope to get up to about 8 to 10 languages within the next several months. You can download the PDF, and you can also order print copies of this booklet in either English or Spanish. And not only is it free of charge, but the New York Life Foundation, which supports our center, pays for the shipping and handling. So it's completely free. So schools can order this and have this in stock just to give out to families. And this is just contact information for the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. So I'm going to stop there, and I will see. I know there was a question about getting the slides. I've made the slides available in a PDF format so that they can be shared. Maybe I'll turn this over. Is it Kelly? You were going to say a little bit more about other resources, and then we'll just answer any other questions that people have.
Before we go to Kelly, I'll ask the questions that were in the chat and then some that were submitted. So it looks like someone asked, what's the best way to respond to a teen who is having physical problems that may be stress and loss related? Well, what if the teen is physically ill and extremely fatigued for over 2 weeks and can't go to school? Sorry.
Okay, so I think first off, if a teenager is physically ill or believes themselves to be physically ill, then I think it is a good idea to probably contact your healthcare provider, such as your pediatrician, to at least assess, because quite honestly, you can have physical complaints and stress-related health problems at the same time, and it's hard to sort them out, particularly for parents. I will share, I remember at one point, my dad was a physician and he used to act as my pediatrician, which by the way is not a good idea, but that's what he did. And I do remember at one point, it was Memorial Day, and I told him, I feel really sick, I'm run down, and I just don't feel well. And he goes, you never like marching. And I go, no, I don't like marching, but I do march when I'm supposed to, but I really don't feel well. And he said, well, I think you just don't want to do this. And it was actually my sister who just said, look, he's got the measles. And I actually was quite sick and had a fever up to 104. So there have been times where I thought people thought things were psychological distress, but they actually weren't. They were physical complaints and vice versa. So I do think it's a good idea to bring in someone who's objective, who can help sort this out, who is, a healthcare provider and can help you figure out, first off, what is going on both emotionally and physically, and how do we address both of those? I'm a developmental behavioral pediatrician, and so the whole philosophy behind our subspecialty is that it's what we call false dichotomy between physical illness and mental health. Our mind-body is not separate. They're actually in the same place, and they affect each other. And so if you have physical illness, it will cause psychological distress. If you have psychological distress, it will cause physical symptoms. You really have to look at both at the same time. So that would be the first thing. Then I would also be helping them deal with what's stressing them. And if I could eliminate that or minimize it, that would be good, but otherwise teaching coping strategies. And so if it turns out that what they have is a physical illness, then they'll need those coping strategies anyway to deal with the distress related to having the physical illness. And if it's predominantly psychological, then those coping strategies will help with what was causing some of the problems. So that's what I would do. And then I would also look to trying to get a kid back if you're concerned that a child has school avoidance. If they're anxious about going back to school, the last thing you want to do is keep them out of school much longer. So if you think this is psychological distress, they're not infectious, they're not a risk of getting anyone else sick, then you want to try and get them back to school at the level they can tolerate. So that might be gradual return to school, but you want to make sure that you're moving in that direction.
They also asked where they could get coping strategies in regards to this last question.
So when you say, where could we get coping strategies? Okay, so I mentioned some of the coping strategies, and I think what I'm going to do is, that's a question I'm going to defer to Kelly, because I know that she has some resources locally. So there are certainly things that parents can read about and help their kids with a lot of these coping strategies, but there also are professionals that are in the school system and health department that can help with that. So Kelly, do you want to take that question? Because I can only talk about it in a general sense.
Sure, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much. It was very informative, and I'm so supportive to all of us having children in the school, like in the school age currently. South Bay Families Connected and Beach Cities Health District would like you all to invite all the attendees to Beach Cities Health District website, and also the South Bay Families Connected website, which has related resources, videos, blogs, and upcoming events, all which can help, as Dr. Schonfeld, as you said, it can be very an individual process. And so looking for resources within our community and curated coping techniques more specific to your child's age group, developmental stage. And on the South Bay Families Connected website, we do have different resources and different techniques and topics that are developmentally appropriate per age group. And also each school, our partner schools, Manhattan Beach School District, Hermosa Beach, Redondo, all have their own partner school pages which detail the resources per individual school district. So thank you so much. And I think that are there any more questions?
Yes, we had a couple more. For our next question, we had someone submit, I promised my 12-year-old child life would get better once vaccinated. Now they're saying we lied. How do we make them trust us, trust their school, trust their world again to keep them safe?
Okay, well, that's a good question, but a complicated one. First off, I try never to promise my kids things that I can't actually do. They figure out, if you don't figure it out, that you're not all powerful and that there's a limit to what you can do. I would say, though, that when you say, the person who asked the question said, my kid's angry at me, or is upset with me, I think they're upset with the situation. I think they recognize that you didn't cause the situation and it's not under your control. So really what you probably meant to say is you're going to do your best and you hope it will get better, and you will try and help to do that, but there's a limit to what you can do. And there's also a limit to what you have done. So a lot of times we apologize for things that aren't under our control. And when kids ask us questions, some of them are rhetorical. Like when they say, why did you do this to me? They know you didn't. They're not really asking for an answer. They're just saying, I'm frustrated that this is happening. And what you can do is hug your kid, when few other people can at this point, or you can just be with them or just say, I'm sorry. It's hard for all of us. And if they say, well, I'm so angry, you can say, yeah, it is pretty upsetting. Some of it is you just have to realize you can't fix everything. And trust me, they know that too. But the fact that they even want you to do it is a good thing. And I think the trust will come back. I'm not sure it was really damaged. I think they may trust that they lost some of their trust that the world is safe and fair because a virus did that. You didn't do it. And unless you brought it into the country, I doubt that's the case. So the bottom line is kids are just frustrated and upset, and they have every reason to be that way. And sometimes we just have to help them just learn to accept that things are not always fair. Good people die. Bad things happen to good people. It's unfortunate. I don't have a reason for it. Some people have, I remember talking to an Amish family that I worked with, and their child had been killed. And they just said, we have a strong religious faith and we trust that God has a reason for this. We know we don't always know the reason, and we don't have to know the reason to know that there is one. That is what our faith has taught us, is that there will be a reason for this, even if it is beyond what we can understand. So we are trusting in God, but we miss the child greatly. We're not happy about this. We don't think it's okay, but we trust there's a reason. And they actually, I think, adjusted to a very tragic event quicker than I saw most people because of their faith. But even then, they weren't pretending or suggesting that they knew the reason. But I think that's what kids do. I remember having a personal tragedy that actually turned out okay, but it seemed very tragic at the time. My daughter was one of my daughters was, I think, like first grade or so. And she just said, Dad, should I be really worried? And I said, I don't know yet. And she looked at me and she said, you know what then? I'm not going to be worried until you tell me it's time. So I just won't be worried now. And I'll wait till you tell me it's time to be worried. Now, I didn't reassure her everything would be okay, even though things turned out all right, because I didn't believe that was what was going to happen. But I did tell her I would be there to support her and that I would be honest and open with her throughout all of it. And I have found by doing that with my kids that they actually do trust me, and they're adults now, but the things that they have told me about themselves and about their friends are things that I don't think kids generally ever tell anyone. And, it's really been a privilege that they'll call me up from out of state and tell me about something as it's happening that usually kids don't talk about, because they trusted that I could help intervene to potentially save the life of a friend, that they gave me permission to talk to parents of friends of theirs, because they thought that I would use good judgment to try and get them help they needed so they wouldn't die from something. And I just think that you live through tragedies and crises with your kids. And one of the things that you can gain from that is a deeper level of trust, that you will be honest, that you will be open, and that you're there for them no matter what is happening, even when you can't fix it, because we can't fix this. We can only try and navigate our way through it as safely as possible.
Okay, for our next question, we have, how can we help kids cope with school anxiety, tests, and public speaking?
Well, first off, there's a tendency for us to try and minimize it and say, it's nothing to be worried about. It's something they're worried about. So just accept that. Don't try and minimize it. So what you can do is say, okay, what are some techniques that you can use to try and deal with anxiety? So you can try and explore with them and with their teacher, maybe with their pediatrician, maybe with somebody in the health department or in the school system that provides mental health services. Help them figure out what it is that both is causing the distress and what are some strategies to deal with the distress. So for example, I didn't talk about cognitive behavioral therapy and cognitive behavioral techniques. Those are techniques that can be taught to children. They actually sound more complicated than they are. They really just are basic strategies for helping children rethink through problems and stressors that can change the way they think about it, which then changes the way they feel about it and ultimately can change their behavior. So as an example, one of the things that kids do, and adults do, by the way, with anxiety, is they catastrophize. You know, something bad happens and they say, oh, everyone hates me. That's why they didn't invite me to the party. I'm never going to have friends. And, you know, if you say to them, well, that's one possibility, but what are some other possibilities here? And then, so you teach them to rethink, to think in different ways. And that's what cognitive behavioral therapy is. So it's not a very complicated technique, and they're just good life skills. So you can find someone who does cognitive behavioral therapy or uses some of those techniques. You can also use self-hypnosis and guided imagery. I personally, I learned how to do self-hypnosis for patient care. And so I taught my kids self-hypnosis when they were young. To be honest, at bedtime, I thought it was a little more interesting for me and them if they used their own visualization instead of reading the same book over and over, because they tended to fall asleep when I did that, which was annoying to them. So we would practice self-hypnosis. For a while we did that. And I remember my daughter was about 8 and she had to have 4 teeth pulled. They were not permanent teeth, but she needed to go to the dentist and have them extracted. And so I asked the dentist, is it okay if I come into the room and I guide her with some self-hypnosis, act as her coach? And he was like, sure, do that. So I came in, I talked with her, I guided her through the process. And I remember when it was all done, she had the gauze and 4 sockets and the blood was oozing out. She just turned to the dentist and she said, when are you going to get started? And he had used Novocaine, but she didn't feel the shot. She wasn't aware of it. And he just said, I've never seen a kid do this before. And she was so proud that she knew how to manage that there was a time period where she wanted to be a dentist or a oral hygienist. And she loved going to the dentist. We still send, she's over 30. We still send holiday cards to that dentist from when she was 8. And she was just, to her, it was just an accomplishment. And so I think you can teach these techniques, self-hypnosis, guided imagery, these behavioral therapies, and they're just coping techniques that kids can use. So they have no risk to them. They're just helpful. And so I would say, look into those resources if someone is having particular issues with anxiety, or even if they're not, and start to use some of them. And even if it turns out they have another reason for their symptoms, they still have these strategies and approaches that will help them.
Okay, and I think we have time for one last question. Are there any lifestyle categories that you'd encourage to simply let go of during this season, or ones that you would want to hold closely with intention, like enrichment activities?
Yeah, so good question. So first off, for whatever reason, and with my wife and myself and my kids, we didn't feel the need to push our children. We wanted them to spend time writing, reading, time in nature. So they participated in sports to a small degree because they wanted to be in good shape. Both of them now have book agents, like they liked writing, and one's just sold a book deal. So they took it, and the other is an editor in a publishing house. So that actually worked. I mean, we didn't do it because we thought that would be a career move for them. So I would say enrichment activities should do exactly that. They should enrich children, not overwhelm them. If it's not adding to who they are as people, it's not enrichment. So don't push kids just to do more, thinking that's somehow better. because actually some unstructured time for self-exploration allows them really to be nurtured and to grow into what they're doing and love what they're doing. So it's the same thing with kind of traditions and vacations and everything. I always tell people, look, if you're pushing yourself during the holidays to try and have the perfect holiday, you're going to be miserable. If you're pushing yourself on vacation to get the most done, you're probably not going to enjoy yourself. So it's time to give up certain things that aren't really important to people. And if they're important and you can't do them, come up with new traditions. So, you know, one of my daughters lives in New York City. And when the pandemic started in March, we were supposed to go on vacation together the next morning. I already had my boarding pass. And I do a lot of work in crisis response and disaster at a national level. And I kind of sensed what was happening. So I just said, get on a plane, come here today. And instead she came the next morning. She packed for a week or two, and she stayed for 10 months and did her work remotely from here. And really, we had a different time together. I don't want to say it was all extremely fun, but I got to do things with her that I never was able to do. I got to explore things. And, you know, we watched television series that she loved, and I grew to like it too. We started other traditions. No, we couldn't do everything because it was a pandemic, but we could still do stuff together. And so what I think you have to do is figure out what it is you can do and try and find some joy in it, and try not to feel badly because of what you can't do, as long as there are things that you can do that you find enjoyment in. So I just think kids and families are overscheduled, overworked, overpressured, and I don't really know what you get out of that other than just exhausted. So if you're spending all of your time rushing to do other things, I don't want to. One of my kids was applying for college, and she was on the varsity soccer team, but she didn't enjoy it. So she quit the week before her application was going into college. And I said, dear, why don't you just stay for one more week? You know, you put it on the application. I mean, you don't have a lot of extracurriculars. And she looked at me and she said, Dad, that would be deceptive because I don't enjoy it and I'm not going to do it in college. So why would I be telling or misleading someone to think that I would? And I was like, okay, integrity, good. Getting into college, also good. But, you know, I respected what she wanted to do. And maybe she didn't get into, you know, a higher ranked college, but she's really quite successful at what she's doing, an extremely competent and happy and productive adult. And I'm proud of her. So I think she was right. You know, at the time I was like, it's just a week, dear, just wait a week. But she was like, no, because it's not true. It's not true to who I am. And I want to be honest and forthright. And I can't really argue with that. So figure out what's really enriching your children. And if it's just something more you're doing, then I use this as an opportunity to just say no and just focus on, you know, spending time that's quality with those you love. And I say the same thing for, you know, holidays. People during holidays, they just overschedule themselves, and the traditions they do are just, they're burdens on them, and they're not really enjoying their time together. And then that isn't enriching. I've spent a lot of time supporting families of kids with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. I won't go into why, but I do that work internationally as well. I have gone every year to England, although this year and last year they're virtual conferences, but I've talked to a lot of those families, and those kids have really progressive neuromuscular disorders and generally have shortened lifespans as a result. And they've kind of taught me, and through what they've shared, that, you know, you have to start giving things up, but you want to always focus on what's important to maintain. And if you can't do what you used to do, you figure out what you want to do that you can enjoy doing and what's meaningful to you. And that exercise, I think, is a good exercise. And if we get that out of this pandemic, that we will figure out what is really most important about what satisfies us, what gratifies us, which brings us, you know, friendship and compassion, then great. then we'll be able to do that in the future and not waste our time on those other things. But I don't know if that answers the question, but that's the way I would approach it.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you once again for coming and presenting and providing all this wonderful information. And thank you everyone who joined us in tonight's speaker series. But this will be the end of the presentation. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening.